So thanks so much for joining. We're going to explore the power of the gaze this afternoon. So just a quick introduction for those that don't know me. My name's Adam. I'm a secondary school teacher, have been for 13 years, and I work in initial teacher training. Recently, at the end of last year, I finished my doctorate exploring the experiences of LGBT teachers and thinking about the concept of visibility, which is obviously a lot of what we'll talk about this evening. And then I'm continuing to do LGBT research, and if you don't know, I'm sure many of you do, me and Joe host the Pride and Progress podcast, which we'll be touching on a bit today as well. So hopefully in this session, I think about half an hour or so, we'll see how we go, but we're going to think about the ways in which minority stress can affect LGBT people, and perhaps think about it from the concept of other marginalised groups as well. We're going to explore how this stress can be magnified or experienced more intensively in panoptic or unregulated spaces. And then hopefully I want to sort of conceptualise this new sort of more empowering form of visibility, because it's a topic I've talked about a lot and it's been a lot part of my research. So I'd like to kind of move the thinking forward on that one a little bit. So I appreciate we've probably got different levels of understanding here. So apologies, this is sucking eggs, but kind of key terms in the presentation. I use LGBT+, of course, there are many versions of it, but that's just perhaps just easiest to say when you're saying it lots of times. Sometimes I might use the word queer. My use of queer, bless you. My use of queer in this presentation is non-heterosexual or non-cisgender, so something of an umbrella term. So cisgender, somebody that identifies with the gender assigned at birth. Heteronormativity, the sort of default silent assumption that you're heterosexual, and similarly with cisnormativity, the assumption that you might be cisgendered as well. So hopefully they make sense as I go through. If there's any terms I use that don't make sense, please just shout out or sneeze. I'm happy to define those as we go. So you may have followed my research already, but it's a very, very quick overview for context for the rest of this presentation. I did a photo elicitation study for my doctoral research. I asked LGBT teachers to take photos of the spaces in their school they felt the most and least safe and comfortable. And that was the range of participants that took part in the study. And then we discussed those photos in interviews, and that obviously created the data through both the photos and the interviews themselves. And then the data and themes were drawn from that. So as you can imagine, there's a ton of really, really fascinating themes. Some of them are here, and I've talked in previous talks about, which I can share the link to, including ideas of embodiment, what it feels like to embody an LGBT identity, masculinity, monosexism, the idea of discrimination against sort of bisexual people. It's fine to be gay or straight, but anything in the middle is kind of discriminated against. Heteronormativity, and then these two big ideas of panoptic spaces and visibility, which I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about now. So I just want to highlight a bit of the literature that I referenced last time, because it's relevant for what I'm going to talk about today, which is this concept of visibility, what it means to be in some way visible. And there are kind of four key ideas that I used in the presentation last time and within the thesis. And the first one is this idea of surplus visibility, Patai's idea of surplus visibility, where she says that people of minority identity are often kind of extrapolated from part to whole. And that becomes the only defining feature of your identity. And you're often then seen to represent the entirety of a minority group, which of course is not only ridiculous, but a very draining and exhausting thing as well. So, you know, that's nearly 30 years old, but I think we can still say in some contexts, that still has real credibility and real relevance. I also use Pelota's three forms of visibility, which I'll talk through, which I think are slightly more contemporary and slightly more nuanced. The first one is passing visibility, which I guess really is invisibility. It's kind of masking the parts that aren't acceptable. So in the case of sexuality, it might be passing as straight or changing behaviour to pass as heterosexual in particular environments. Let somebody in. Bordering visibility talks about that sort of constant code switching, changing. So in some spaces you're visible, in some spaces you're invisible, in some spaces you change how you behave depending on who's there. And we've kind of akin it to a dimmer switch before, which is kind of constantly thinking about, right, what can I reveal and what can't I reveal in certain spaces? So constantly bordering and monitoring the idea of behaviour. And the final form is called polluting visibility, which, despite I don't really like the name of sort of toxic undertone, but it talks about that power to disrupt in spaces and make hopefully positive change, but change of some sort. So I think those concepts of visibility are helpful to briefly just touch upon again and remind ourselves of, because that's kind of where I'm going to develop that point going further. But ultimately, being visible is therefore to be seen, which leads us to this idea of panoptic spaces. Excuse me. So panoptic spaces is one of the biggest themes that came out of my research. And I spent a long time thinking about it in the research. And even though I've finished, I've still spent a long time thinking about it because I don't really feel like I've cracked a good understanding of it, which is why I'm kind of doing this presentation to keep developing my thoughts on it. But Within panoptic space in school, open spaces in school, a lot of the teachers described perceived threats. They were worried something might happen in these spaces. More often than not, and I really mean that more often than not, 99% of the time nothing happened in these spaces. But the perception that it might was enough for them to feel concerned or fearful or, Joe, do you mind doing the acceptance for me? People in the bar, bro. That fear that something might happen made them feel uncomfortable, even in these spaces, regardless of whether something happened or not. And like I say, it tended to be these unregulated spaces, in contrast to the spaces like their classroom, which is highly regulated because there's seating plans, the kids, you can escalate things if needed to, you have those existing relationships. It was these spaces that lacked all those things where they felt unsafe or potentially uncomfortable. And as I talked about a second ago, as a consequence, this code switching, this changing of behaviours or the way we speak or our mannerisms, the way we walk, whatever it might be, it became this constant state of self-policing. Where they're changing the ways in which they behave. And there's one quote here which I'm going to come back to later on, and it refers to this photo in the bottom right. But this teacher had been at their previous school, a Catholic school, they'd been forced to sign an NDA, so they couldn't tell anyone they were gay because it was against the Catholic teachings of the school. So when she moved to this new school, she still felt this paranoia, this self-policing about her. And there's this quote here. And she said, and then I was always very conscious of not going anywhere where we could potentially be seen by kids and worrying if we were. I'm worried what the implications would be if we were found out. And there was a lot of this narrative, even though she was no longer in that space, she continuously felt that internalized sense of policing and needing to monitoring of her behaviours. So this is the question that stuck in my head for ages. Even though I'd finished the thesis and passed and, nice feedback on this section, I didn't feel like I really got my head around it from an academic point of view. I could totally experience it from my own life and think I feel uncomfortable in certain spaces even though things haven't happened to me. But this was kind of my quandary. Why do teachers feel unsafe in these spaces when nothing, most of the time, had never happened to them there? And I wanted to grapple that somewhat academically to give it some credibility, so also we can think about what schools perhaps need to do more of, because even though the teachers aren't experiencing these issues in these spaces, that lack of that feeling of uncomfortability or whatever it might be, anxiety, is no less real. So that's the idea of minority stress, the minority stress model, has really helped me develop my thinking on this, and I think helps to kind of somewhat explain why they might experience that in those environments. So this is development of Mayer's 2003 theory. This quote is quite a nice summary. So one elaboration of social stress theory may be referred to as minority stress, to distinguish the excess stress to which individuals from stigmatized social categories are exposed as a result of their social, often a minority, position. And I found that really helpful to then start thinking about stress as that feeling in those spaces. Like I say, regardless of something actually happened, that feeling of stress is probably what they're feeling within those spaces. As always, when we're talking about this, intersectionality is important to consider. We don't lead single issue lives. It's important we think about we are all these things at all times, and they interleave and interweave, and they influence each other in myriad ways. So I think it's important to think about intersectionality, and we'll come back to that shortly. But it might be that you're not LGBT on this call this evening, but actually you might have a different characteristic that in some spaces makes you feel marginalised. So it might be helpful or useful for you to consider your experience of minority stress from a different perspective. And we're talking about LGBT, but it can be conceptualized in a number of ways. So the minority stress model is quite cumbersome, for want of a better word. I've tried to draw it out so I can explain it one part at a time, and hopefully this makes sense. So the minority stress model basically says that all people experience stress in life. That's the very nature of life. I'm sure perhaps during our day-to-day we've all experienced stress at some point. So everybody experiences stress, general stresses, we might call those, okay? And they could be influenced by the circumstances in our environment. It could be any number of things, but whatever those circumstances are, whether it's the kids waking you up early or work you've got to do at school or any number of things, are going to lead to a number, general stress just there. The model then says, and it purposely overlaps, that your minority status, and obviously we're discussing LGBT, but it could be a number of other minority statuses. Is that plural? Stati? No, statuses. Whatever your minority status is going to overlap with that and may cause additional stresses. So the first of those two types I want to sort of highlight and we'll talk more about is this idea of distal. So minority stress processes, distal stresses. And these might be some experience of prejudice events. So we've experienced some discrimination, whether it's name calling, whether it's where we've been treated at work, it could be violence, it could be something back from our childhood, years and years and decades ago. but a discriminatory experience based upon our minority status. That's what we might call as a distal stressor. But we need to differentiate our minority status with our identity, because those things become part of our identity, for better or worse, and hopefully the better is what we're going to talk about today. But that's a really important aspect as well. And when our status becomes part of our identity, then we might start to internalise, again, overlapping proximal stressors. And this is the bit that I think really helps conceptualise what it is I've just been talking about. So from having this proximal stress, it's these types of things. It's the fear of having discrimination. You've had it at some point in your life, and it could have been such a long time ago, it's not relevant anymore, but it doesn't make it any less real. So the fear of that discrimination. It could be expectations of rejection, because you know what that feels like. You've been rejected in the past, whether it's in a formal way from a job or from a social group or for family members when you've come out perhaps. It could be any number of things. Having to conceal, at some point in the LGBT people's lives, some shorter than others, they've concealed their own identity. Okay, that has that real sense of minority stress about it. And it could be, we had a long conversation on the podcast this week about gay shame, that internalized homophobia. For me, growing up Section 28, kind of soaked in shame for 20 years, it's pretty hard to unravel that quite quickly. So you keep that with you. So we've got the distal stresses there, the things that are kind of tangible, things that have really happened, and the proximal stresses that perhaps are based upon things that have happened, or even just worst case scenarios, but it doesn't make them any less real. And those stresses are really, really important for us to think about. So Mayer says all of these things, in somewhat of a flowchart I suppose, link to mental health outcomes. Could be negative, could be positive, and obviously we're going to think about those in a minute. Could be somewhere in the middle, of course. But there's two other factors that might link into that flowchart, which might dictate whether it's a negative or positive outcome. This one says characteristics of minority identity. How we assimilate those characteristics into our identity, the things that are positive, the things that are negative. Is it our entire part of identity, like we talked about with surplus visibility? Have we grown pride in those? What is the environment like that's allowed us to either accept or perhaps reject part of our identity as well? And the final part of this very perhaps confusing flowchart is coping and social support. How much community and individual support is that person had or have? So all of these things feed in, which then let's think about, do LGBT people in this instance or other minority groups, what kind of mental health outcomes do they have? And it helps us visualise that often and historically they have negative mental health outcomes. And that's perhaps not shocking when we think about some of those. But what I want to think about today is how we flip this on its head to create hopefully more positive outcomes and turn these identities into positive things. So just to break those down in a bit more detail then, the distal distresses. So again, prejudice or discriminatory events that might have happened to you. It could be the microaggression stuff that happens every day. I just thought I'd share one that happened to me 2 weeks ago. Before my whole day, I thought, go and get my hair cut before I went to Greece last week. But my usual barber's wasn't open, so I had a proper panic. I thought, right, I'll try somewhere new in town. Looked around, I thought, oh God, this is my worst. Like, go to the car garage for me, it's a bloody nightmare. But someone had a Pride sticker in their window. I thought, right, that's a good place to go, that feels safe. I went in, started getting my hair cut, and I thought, oh no, I made a terrible mistake. It was a really laddie environment. These two barbers were having awful banter. And then, natural conversations, what are you doing next week? I said, going on holiday with my partner. And then he said, oh, what's your missus' name? First microaggression. And then I was like, right, do I bother in this environment? I thought, no, I'll be brave. And I said, oh, his name is da-da-da. And then a blank look on his face, like he'd never heard of this information before. And then just, but you don't look gay. And I thought, oh God, that's 2 for the price of 1 there. So I thought I could apologise for this, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I just left it. We just sat awkwardly, and I thought, right, I'll just absorb the shame on this one, shall I? So those are the kind of things that might be distal distresses. It could be structural or systemic stuff. In a school, it could be, what title do I use? A lot of teachers on podcasts might use gender neutral ones, MX for example. Some schools aren't set up for that, or boxes and things on forms. It could be the facilities you use in the space, toilets or whatever. A lot of people I spoke to in the research, the equalities question when applying for jobs about sexuality and gender, they're like, oh, I want to be honest, will there be discrimination against the job? Even though they say it's private, I know they're going to see it. And there's this whole kind of internal monologue about not wanting to lie, but worrying that telling the truth might mean they don't get the job. So there's just all this stuff that people often don't think about. And there's another word there which is homonormative, which kind of describes which LGBT identities get acceptance in heterosexual society or heteronormative society. So kind of, middle class white gay men, not really a big problem, but perhaps the identities that challenge those binaries a bit more, perhaps non-binary, bisexual, perhaps have a more challenging time because society is very binary and they like to think in binary ways. And there's an example there from a bisexual person in my research who was with a girl and then was with a guy later on. And then the staff room said, oh, so is he gay now? He must be gay now. Sort of invalidating that identity, trying to work out, I can only understand straight or gay, I can't understand bisexual. Right, he's gay now. I can process that in my little box in my mind. So those are the little things, but they're stress about sharing those information. And it can come from what's missing. Our podcast talks about this a lot. Positive images lacking from our childhood, role models, celebration, guidance, support, the things that perhaps a lot of us didn't have. I'm assuming here somewhat, but a lot of us may not have had with our childhood. And I've put in there in brackets sort of the idea of, if you've watched Heartstopper, the brilliant Netflix kind of queer drama, we've talked a lot on the show, we did a Heartstopper special. And a lot of people have described a sort of melancholy after watching it. And I think that comes from that. It's like, oh, that's just amazing, but I wish I could have had that. What influence would I have had on my life had I had that? So I think that's a nice example of what that might look like. And then proximal stresses, like I say, it's the fear of them happening. But what's really crucial is the fear of these events potentially happening can be as stressful as them actually happening. And I think this is what's important for school leaders to know, because their schools can be totally safe, but inside the heads of marginalised teachers, they're still experiencing anxiety and stress. Okay, it's just as real, or somewhat just as real. And for a lot of LGBT teachers, that's coming out. How do I do it? When do I do it? How often? All the time. People ask the question. Joe and I joke about this, laugh on the podcast. When did you come out? Which time? 5 times today. 5 times tomorrow, probably. Every new year, new students, there's a lot of factors. It's not a one-time process. It could be that delayed development of a sense of self and identity because you didn't have those role models, those support, that opportunity to grow and flourish and explore your identity. So some sort of stagnation or stunting of development. Catherine Lee, our podcast a few weeks ago, talked about this beautifully, that constant assessment of risk. 2 steps ahead, what can I share with this person? What can't I share with this person? Should I tell the barber? Probably shouldn't have, it was too much effort. But constantly evaluating what you should and shouldn't say. And then this is an interesting one. And then I don't know, Ash, I'm going to share the story, if you're happy to, about you correcting me on your name yesterday. Is that okay? I don't know if Ash can hear me.
Oh yes, I can, Adam. You're welcome to share.
Thank you. So this idea of the burden of making sure the people around us are more comfortable than we are, and Ashlyn is part of our skit course, and her name is spelled Aisling, and she was explaining yesterday how often at the university people think it's Aisling, and she always corrects them. But after a while, especially when it's senior people, there's a certain kind of fatigue and exhaustion with that, or even like not wanting to correct your superiors. So Ash said yesterday, like, I'd rather just stay more comfortable. I accept it. And that constant burden of having to accept it so other people feel more comfortable around us, I think is something that a lot of us can identify with. So that was a little example yesterday. And while we were joking about it, it's actually invalidating, isn't it? Because you're constantly having your identity invalidated in one way or another. And another example of that, when I was new to my school, which wasn't that long ago, the head of department, we were just chatting. It was like just before Christmas, asking what we're doing, and I said, "Oh, going out with my partner." No, so I'm going away over the holidays, and he said, "Oh, with your missus." And I just said, now normally, and I still do this sometimes, I do this whole song and dance of apology so they don't feel uncomfortable. And I thought, I'm not doing this. It's exhausting. So he said, "Your missus," and I just went, "Mister," and I just left it. And watched, he just squirmed and apologised. But normally I leap in because I can't bear the people feeling uncomfortable. But for the first time, I was quite proud of myself. I just left it. And I thought, actually, maybe next time he won't assume pronouns of somebody. So I'm trying my best, and I still do it because I'm a people pleaser in life. But it's trying my best. It shouldn't be my job to absorb that feeling of uncomfortableness, and hopefully let people realise that perhaps that's their job as well. And then finally, the isolation of thinking no one is like you. LGBT people don't necessarily recognise one another unless they're in a specific safe space, unlike perhaps other protected characteristics such as ethnicity. So hopefully that's kind of given a summary of the types of stresses that LGBT people in this example and other marginalised groups might experience in certain spaces. So I'm just going to ask for just one bit of interactivity. The whole point of this theory is that everybody experiences stress anyway, but marginalised group people experience additional stress. So let's think about something that's already stressful, starting a new job. So obviously we'll think about teaching here today. So just using the chat bar for me, and I've perhaps mentioned a few, feel free to develop for me. You may not be LGBT, but you might put yourself in those shoes. What extra stresses may an LGBT person experience in starting a new teaching job? Just perhaps in the chat bar, that'd be great. And my 2 cats have just come in from the rain, so if you hear meowing or fighting, that's what's going on. I'm having the online teaching moment where you think, is anyone actually there? Or I thought everyone's just typing. So Alex has said pronouns and name might not match legal documentation yet. Brilliant example, Alex. Eleanor, whether they can have pictures of partners up in the room in the office. That's a really recurring theme we talk about. Joe's put, being the only person who looks visibly indifferent in an educational space. Yeah. Ooh, coming through thick and fast. Martha, knowing the assumptions will exist about you. Sorry, it moved on there. Let me just go back. About who your partner may be. Interesting, yeah. Rhiannon, navigating the school environment, how welcoming they are to LGBT, yeah, and that fear of not knowing, and are they sort of outwardly facingly telling you they're going to be inclusive? Alex, how staff deal with students around the LGBT issues. Excuse me. Joe said uniform policies, which are often gendered. Adele, worrying about being stereotyped or pigeonholed in terms of career progression. Being told not to do pride, yeah. Fear of parents and their responses, Eleanor. Not being able to use a toilet that matches their gender. Thinking about what you disclose to new colleagues, anticipating responses. How parents might deal with LGBT parents. Brilliant. Well, I say brilliant, but you know what I mean. Really rich data, really rich conversation. Fear of the unknown in terms of school culture, staff, parents and students. Being the token LGBT person, yep, that's that kind of surplus visibility again, isn't it? Being caught LGBT spaces, yeah, people worry about that, whether it's a nightclub or something, or just out and about, but being caught or seen in a space. So I mean, what we've written 20 things there in the space of 2 minutes. I think it just really captures that internal fear people have that perhaps, I'm not going to stereotype. Well, I'm going to stereotype. Perhaps a straight SLT member thinks, well, what are they worrying about? None of that stuff actually happens at our school. Doesn't make it any less real. Those are all things that I'm sure a lot of us can identify or worry about in starting new jobs, along with all the other stresses of starting a new job. There's enough stress there, but these are additional things. Alex, becoming the educator on issues and terms, yeah, assuming that you're kind of the oracle and you have to do all the work on that as well. Brilliant. Those are a really helpful list, and it allows me to think about some I haven't thought about as well. So thank you for sharing those. And if you think of more as we go through, please feel free to add them. Adele's added, having an increase of student disclosures if you're out to staff, but not having power to change. Yeah. These are really serious issues, aren't they? And it's a lot to think about. And I think it's, we want to capture this information so people who are decision makers in schools can realise the significance, perhaps, of that burden, of that anxiety, of that worry. Okay, I'll move on, but like I say, please feel free to add more, but thank you for sharing those. So, I just thought of a few, but the list we just produced collectively was much better. But, the general stresses already of starting that job, thinking about how supportive and inclusive the school are. I remember starting my new school and looking at the website and there was nothing. And I thought, well, I'm confident enough and I know my stuff enough that I'm all right to go into that space, but I still felt unsure. And, of course it was fine, but I didn't know that and it still played on my mind. Again, what's completing the application form? I'm going to just throw to Joe here if that's okay, because Joe shared this story on the podcast the other day and I think it's quite a nice, I keep saying nice, like these are positive things, but a relevant example of what we're talking about.
Sure, yeah. So when I applied for my current position that I teach in now, first of all, I looked at every school's website that I was interested in applying to try and look for some kind of clue that it would be a safe place for me as a gender diverse person. And then when I came to apply for this school, which I thought showed enough evidence that it might be enough safe space, the application form asked me to identify my gender with the box male and female. So I drew my own box next to it and wrote the words that I identify with and ticked that box and sent it in, and fortunately got a job there.
But it's frustrating that you had to feel that anxiety, but also, and we'll talk about the power of this later, that disruption. And actually, obviously you got the job, which is an amazing thing. And one more follow-up question, Joe, that's all right. Do you think being a disruptor in that space, and obviously they weren't set up for that, do you feel there's been positive developments as a consequence of your employment there?
I'd hope so. Their application form hasn't changed.
Really, unbelievable.
Frustrating. So there's slow progress. I think it takes a long time. Schools are very set in their ways. Often they do things because they've done them for a long time, and it takes a while for them to change. But yeah, there's been small steps of progress since I joined. Brilliant.
Yeah, ripple effects. It takes time, these things, but even small changes, it's in the right direction, isn't it? Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. I won't go back to Joe, but we've had a lot of conversations about this in the podcast about what is professional attire, what's male attire, what's female attire. So this is just a plug for the podcast, really, isn't it? Do I come out like we talked about? Staff, students, when, how often? Oh, what a drain that is. which facilities, the fear of conflict with religion. We did some great episodes on our podcast thinking about that, and obviously George is a big proponent of that and a really good speaker on that. Appropriate, we've covered most of these, but I think, just that final one, how to navigate social situations. Even if you are out to almost everybody, you don't know if everyone knows that you're out, and there becomes a whole conversation about that. So this is a really useful diagram, and it's called the cost of the closet. I'll just let you look at it for a moment. And Max has written, probably echoed already, but getting surprised by a student question about LGBT people, wondering whether I'll be able to answer honestly without SLT parent context. Because in a face context, that's it's a very we've had that a few times, Max, and thank you for sharing that. So I think this flow, it just captures it nicely. And again, if you are LGBT, you can probably picture this in your life, whether it's now or in the past. But this constant 2 steps ahead permutation, what did they know? What did they come on, share? And these batteries just perfectly capture the draining energy that this can have. And more often than not, and I certainly did this, when I wasn't particularly out at the start of my career, you just shut stuff down all the time. And it just means you can't create genuine relationships. And it's really lonely. It's really sad. It's really exhausting. But I think this is a good example of thinking about that constant 2 steps ahead thinking that a lot of LGBT people have to do in all spaces, but particularly the work environment. So, bringing it back to the idea of panoptic spaces then. We've talked about what some of these stresses might look like. I'm trying to think about why these panoptic spaces kind of amplify that or intensify that. So I've used the word panopticon a bit in this presentation already, so quick definition. So a panopticon is a disciplinary concept brought to life in the form of a central observation tower placed within a circle of prison cells. And Jerry Bentham was kind of the originator of this. From the tower, a guard can see every cell and inmate, but the inmates can't see into the tower. Prisoners will never know whether or not they're being watched. And of course, the purpose of that is to create a sense of self-policing, an internalised sense of discipline where you are controlling your own behaviour, because there could theoretically be no one in that tower and you're still disciplining yourself. And I think that's a really good way of conceptualising what we're doing in these spaces in schools, whether they're panopticons or not, those open spaces. We're doing the internalised policing, we're doing the internalised kind of scrutiny, and we're changing and modifying the behaviours consequently. So these panoptic spaces then in these panoptic spaces, we're experiencing proximal stress. So to summarise the points I've made then, schools can feel unsafe even if they're not. And that's such a tough pill to swallow or try and get people to believe. Like when you're talking to leaders about this stuff, schools can feel unsafe even if they're not. But they're like, well, my school is safe, and Ofsted says so shut up. Okay, but actually, it doesn't mean your experience of it is any less genuine. And we kind of need to, hopefully, using a bit of academia, we can legitimise that so people realise the significance of it. And then it's thinking, what are the implications? Should schools go above and beyond, or is their school already outstanding and there's no issues there at all? None. But do schools need to do more or not? And that brings that to conversation of equality versus equity. If it's safe for most people, but I don't feel safe as an LGBT person, do I need extra stuff to make me feel safe? And I think the answer is yes, but I think trying to get people to understand that is perhaps the challenge. So just to share a couple of these photos with a bit of narrative. This is from a participant who had been in that school for 15 years. They had one awful, admittedly, incident where they got transphobic abuse shouted at them on the playground, and they didn't know who the kid was, and it was 10 years prior to them taking part in this research, and nothing had happened since then. And it's not to belittle that incident, but nothing had happened since then. But they still felt unbelievably anxious about being on duty because that incident wasn't dealt with properly, and they were just deathly worried it would happen again. 10 years on, nothing had happened, but they still every single time felt anxious. So that space for them was of significance. This is a photo of the person who at the previous school had signed the NDA, and she described her car as the only place she felt safe, because it was her space, a safe space. The minute she stepped out, she felt anxious. She loved the school, had no issues. They felt they were pretty inclusive, to use her words, but she still felt that feeling of exposure. This is from a head teacher who loved the school but he worried about assemblies. He was worried about kids shouting out, homophobic slurs. Can you imagine the head teacher at the front of the room getting homophobically abused? Almost improbable. But he still felt really anxious. It was the constant monologue in the back of his mind that it might happen, and how he would deal with it if in front of 100, 200 kids, how he might deal with it. And this is another teacher who just in a number of photos that those transitional spaces between buildings on duty, walking through the hall at lunchtime. Again, nothing had ever happened there, but he felt a sense of anxiety, of elevation, of stress in those spaces. So, me and Joe's podcast tries to be quite positive, but we do need to acknowledge the kind of challenges, which I've done. The negative bit's done now. So let's think about how can schools use the minority stress model to support and empower their LGBT staff to try and have more inclusive environments and staff that feel supported and, like I say, empowered. So let's look at the minority stress model once more. And I've tried to identify, and I've pinched bits of this research and developed it in my own way. Where are the pinch points? Where are the things that lead to the negative mental health outcomes? And what do we do to flip it and hopefully encourage positive outcomes? So the first few are fairly, perhaps, I don't know, obvious is the right word, but expected. So, it's legislation and education. So in a global context, that's going to be the Equality Act within the school. That's going to be things like anti-homophobic policies or whatever it might be. So things that you would very much hope to be in place in schools as well. And similarly, if something happens, then there's a policy and process to follow that up and the sanctions and so on. So those things aren't going to change the world, but they're things that we expect to be in place. The things that, and Joey and I talked about this on the NASBIT podcast a few weeks ago about the idea of professional identity. This is the stuff we think needs to happen. So trying to work out, right, I've worked out my identity as a teacher and I'm a gay person, but how do I overlap the two? Where does the Venn diagram cross over? And how do I have a professional identity and bring that to work? And that's where people need support with that. And I think it needs to be in the ITT, in the teacher training. It needs to be in the ECT. It needs to be all parts of the career. And I don't think that's just LGBT people, but we don't really talk about professional identities at all in training for teacher training with the core content framework, and it's the utmost importance. Of course it's going to evolve throughout your career, but it's incredibly important. And there's leaders courses through things like LGBT Ed, and there's various MPQs. There's a ton of stuff we can do to really get people to understand what it is to be an LGBT teacher, the power of that, and also what they can and can't do, because that's often the fear of people. So I think that would be really helpful in forming that identity in a positive way. I think that bit that's really intangible and hard to kind of hammer down, I think we need to think about what extra things need to be in place for those people. So it could be mentorship. Okay, is it whether it's an LGBT person or a person that can mentor you and perhaps, I don't know if reassures the right word, but let you know that you are in a safe space and what you're doing and all those types of things. Having safe spaces in the school. Most schools or lots of schools have pride clubs now, which is brilliant for the kids. Well, if you've got enough, hopefully, critical mass of staff, you can have a group of LGBT staff, have a safe space for them as well. Okay, spaces they can go and people that will understand this stuff. If you explain this stuff to other people in the staff room, they might just shrug it off or not understand. Other people with the same lived experience would understand this, and that's really important. And that gives empowerment, okay, and empowering those staff to do things, giving them the responsibility to do as well. In terms of that characteristics then, and there's a lot of overlap with these things, I think it's having positive role models, again, whether it's in or out of the profession. Positive narratives, which is what our podcast is all about, creating a positive narrative, because all the narrative up to this point is miserable and negative, and that's the literature. Whatever you read, you wouldn't want to go into the profession. We need to create the positive narratives for people and the opportunities that literally say, we want LGBT people at this school because we appreciate the brilliant stuff they're going to bring. And then finally, it's that support outside of that. So it could be, Twitter is an amazing resource. I wouldn't even know Joe if it wasn't for Twitter, and now we've got a podcast and, do loads of work together. So that's the power of social networks. There's amazing stuff there. There's great LGBT clubs, or clubs is the wrong word, sounds a bit like the youth club. There's great LGBT organisations through the unions, teaching unions, and they do amazing events every year. And again, there's that sense of support and LGBT networks, LGBT Ed, Diverse Ed, and so on. So there's tons and tons of networks out there. So I think if we really think about these pinch points and trying to flip these negative experiences into positive experiences, hopefully we're going to see more of those positive outcomes. And rather have staff that are kind of, fearful of being seen, they're going to be proud of being seen and have positive influences on the school. So part of minority stress model is something, or a development of it is the minority resilience model. If you've been through a pretty tough experience, you're going to have some sense of resilience. And actually there's maybe some positive marginality to come from that as well. And in the podcast and in literature, we describe that as queer capital. The benefits we have, for want of a better word, of being queer people, of being LGBT people. Now, Catherine gets a lot of free publicity from me. I reference this article all the time, but she wrote a great article a few years ago talking about why LGBT people might make exceptional school leaders. And it touches upon some of the things we've talked about already. So the ability to read people, having compassion for others. Once you've been through something horrific, you don't want others to have that. Making connections. If you can share something personal, other people want to do the same, and there's a sense of trust that's created. Managing uncertainty and risk-taking, because we do a lot of that in our lives up to that point. So I really like the article. I'm going to encourage you to read it. I think it kind of captures perhaps what positive marginality looks like, or queer capital. In the podcast, Catherine said, if section 28 was the lemons, then this is our lemonade. This is the good stuff that's come from our pretty horrible upbringings. And I think just developing that further, some of these developments at the same point. But if you are able to be visible as an LGBT and share something, you actually very quickly make relationships with people, because if you share something personal, they want to too. And it develops empathy in people, because we talk about the language, and we talked about this in the skit yesterday, of normalize, and a better word being usualize, but an even better word is humanize. Because once you put a face to something, it's not a big, scary, intangible thing anymore, and that develops that empathy. So I think that really can help. I'll get my badge, Ash. Ash made these amazing badges for our skit yesterday called Find Your Tribe. She made one for every member of the skit, which is how amazing she is. But it's that chosen family, is finding your tribe. That is the brilliant thing about being LGBT. You can literally find a chosen family and they'll support you. And that's one of the joyous things about being a queer person. Free of heteronormative pressures. My little brother, he's 33, just got engaged. My big brother's got 2 kids. My little brother's just got engaged, and the whole family's harassing him for when he's going to have kids. Simon got the same. I've never had that. That constant harassment of when you're getting married, when you're getting kids. And actually, I know it sounds like a glib thing to say, but you can opt into those things if you want to, but you do avoid some of those trappings, which we might consider a positive thing. A sense of moral purpose for teachers that are doing positive things about this, and there are so many on this call alone, but lots of people we speak to, it gives that real sense of purpose, and I think that's a really great thing if you've got it. We talked about the networks of support. It gives you a critical awareness, a critical consciousness. When you identify the factors that discriminate, marginalise people, the things that do and don't include and exclude people, it makes you really aware of them. And like microaggressions, most people don't notice them, but you do, and you notice them in other people and other marginalised groups, and it allows you to call stuff out and identify things, and it just gives you, I always use the Matrix analogy, you start seeing the world in code, don't you, because you see the things that do and don't include you within systems. So I think that's a really, really important point, and something that marginalised people have in spades, not to generalise, but I just have. And then finally, this idea, and I talked about wanting to conceptualise a new form of visibility, and talking about what powerful visibility might be. So in my previous talk, and obviously just referenced it at the start there, I talked about all these types of visibility: surplus, pollering, passing, bordering, polluting. It's convoluted, it's confusing, it gives you a sense of being isolated and lonely and kind of for the world to see. And while the literature says that, I think we need to create new narratives for people. We need to conceptualize a new form of visibility, which I think should be called positive visibility. I think when you conceptualize what that looks like, we need to really create those narratives for people so they can see themselves. So what might powerful visibility look like then? Like I said, we need to conceptualise a new form, not one that is couched in these deficits, this uncertainty, but has that word power. I can't say it enough because it's such an important word, and it's the word that people use that we've spoken to that have, been involved in this work or been on the podcast and those types of things. What's that? So Young, and we talk about this in the skit, describes powerful knowledge, Matt will like this, as knowledge that enables students to think beyond the limits of their own understanding and experience. Well, actually, a lot of the teachers we speak to do that through their visibility, do that through their relationships, do that by being authentic in their spaces, which is why powerful knowledge, I think we need to think about what does powerful visibility look like, because it can do all those things that is described there. So, like I say, many people that we've spoken to are able to achieve this, and they have radically, and I mean quite sincerely, progressed the cultures of their schools, the attitudes of the staff, the way the students have become armies of allies, to quote some of them from the podcast, the way the schools have changed policies, the things they do, is unbelievable. And that's from the visibility of these people that are making people question their own views, humanising experience, and realising that it's not this big thing to be feared, but something that's actually quite beautiful. So, to create these positive narratives, then, we need to consider that with the right environments, it's important to caveat that, LGBT teachers may have access to this powerful visibility. Imagine telling someone that when they enter the profession. As an LGBT teacher, you can have access to powerful visibility. God, I want that. I don't want to have surplus visibility or bordering or toxic. I want powerful visibility. So, if we can present this alternative narrative, I think more LGBT teachers will feel empowered to be their authentic, visible selves. Hopefully, it'll attract more people to the profession, but ultimately, it's going to make them feel authentic in their visible selves. And I think with this visibility, we can allow teachers to develop more meaningful relationships with students and colleagues, destabilise that dreaded heteronormativity, which therefore creates more empathetic and inclusive environments for all. There's always this conversation about why we're doing it for the few. We're not. It makes everybody feel more included, and everyone will feel more safe, and everyone feel less constricted. Even if you're heterosexual and cisgendered, you're still constricted and restricted by heteronormativity. So, if LGBT teachers saw their visibility as a source of strength and power rather than one of weakness and deficit, the implication for teachers, students and schools, I really do think could be transformational. The teachers that have been involved in my research, in our podcast, have all come back to us afterwards and talked about the liberation it gave them, the empowerment it gave them, and that sense of what's the right word? I can't think of the word, but I'll come back to it in a second. But that sense of empowerment, because actually when people are historically marginalised or have to be quiet or lower their voice or hide their voice, the minute you give them a platform or a megaphone, it's transformational. And they can't turn that off again. So the people that have been on the podcast or involved in my research for like 2 hours have come back to me and said, I've got the confidence now to go to my school and address this. I've started a pride club. I wear a badge on my lanyard and have these amazing conversations. I've gone for promotions I was scared to. That's just come from a couple of hours of having your voice amplified. So if we can do that on a grander scale, I think that's going to be, like I say, transformational. So what might this powerful visibility look like? So this is where I'm going to do the final podcast plug. But on our podcast, like I said, Joe's and I's intention is to make it a positive conversation and create those positive narratives. And our final question to all of our interviewees is what's the best thing about being an LGBTQ educator or an ally? And Joe did this amazing little 2-minute montage here summarising the responses, which I think helps us conceptualise what this powerful visibility might look like.
What's the best thing about being an LGBTQ plus educator or ally?
It's the chance to offer people something that you didn't have yourself.
Is the joy and privilege of working with our diverse, unique young people and the potential for making change.
Being the representation that I wish I had.
It's knowing that I'm making a difference for the lives of children and young people.
I can be my authentic self with students, with staff, with parents.
Because I've got now students who know that I'm an out gay teacher and they're seeing me as someone who will be comfort, somebody who will be reassurance.
Walking into my classroom, they've got a safe space where they can be their most authentic self.
I get to talk about queer history, queer lives, and issues and topics that just were never taught to me when I was at school.
Through running an LGBT club, I get to be in a queer space, which is just such a powerful thing to be able to do.
But it gives me empathy towards other people who would consider themselves to be outsiders.
As a minority, it gives me that privilege to sort of see difference and appreciate it and be an ally to as many different groups as I can be.
I see it as my moral duty to educate children for the world in which we live.
We have to trust our children. Our children are full of acceptance and hope.
You can sort of almost see like the cogs turning in the pupils' heads and you actually see that understand something better.
The only way to find real happiness and find your happy ending. Being true to yourself, being who you really, really are.
This is it. This is who I am. I don't deny my existence.
To feel confident that the person I am is someone I have worked years to become, but it's also someone who I would have liked to look up to as a kid.
Choosing to be authentic and open and honest and unashamed. I've learned to celebrate myself.
Having access to this just amazing network of LGBT teachers I didn't realise was there, and God, I wish I'd known sooner.
I'm an ally to diverse educators, making sure that everyone has that sense of belonging and everyone is seen and heard.
I feel like we know how this is going to end. It's going to end with all schools doing this work.
I am a living example of someone who's being othered and still that there is a place in this world for me.
What's the best thing?
So that brings us to the end. Thank you for listening. Feedback is welcome in the sense that we'll hopefully turn this into a paper at some point. Oh, Bertie's come to say hello for the big finale. Here's Bertie, everyone. Feedback is welcome because, like I said, I'm going to hopefully, this will be a paper at some point. So if there's things you think need challenging, if there's perhaps academia or papers that might support that, I'll be grateful for any feedback. So